Now I want to switch here, and this is a big switch to our second topic. So Matthew is methodical. That's our first M. Now I want to switch to Matthew, one of his major themes, and that is apostling. His theme of apostling. And this is basically discipleship. First of all, what is an apostle? An apostle is one that is a sent one that's commissioned. And so the word apostle means to send, apostolos, okay, to send, a sent one sent with a commission. Usually a king or somebody would send out a representative or a delegate or an ambassador that represents his wishes and things like that. So the person would be a sent one, sent out to declare the king's message. Discipleship theme. So this discipleship theme, we want to look at this. And as we do, we ask questions like this. How does one begin to be a disciple of Jesus? What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? How does one begin to be a disciple of Jesus? Peter, as we said before, is going to be portrayed in the book of Matthew. Why will Peter play such a prominent role? Peter will be portrayed, I think, because Peter is the consummate disciple. Matthew is wanting to develop this theme of discipleship, what it means to be a disciple. And I think Peter will be used as an example to model that discipleship. There are so many unique stories. There are so many unique stories about Peter in Matthew. And I think the reason is because I think Peter is the consummate disciple. For example, the walking on water in Matthew chapter 14, verse 28 and following. Peter, in Mark, we just looked at that before. In Mark, the story is told that Jesus is walking on the water. Then Jesus gets into the boat and rebukes his disciples a little bit and stuff. But he gets into the boat. Jesus walks and gets into the boat. In the book of Matthew, Peter actually gets out of the boat and walks to Jesus. Peter, again, I think it's when it showed there's a disciple of Jesus putting it all in line, getting out, having enough guts to get out of the boat. And then Peter falls in the water. Jesus pulls him out and rebukes him for little faith, okay? And so Peter walking in the water. Matthew is the only one who tells that story. Matthew is the only one that tells the story of Peter falling in the water. And so I think that's significant. Here's another one. Peter rocks Satan. You guys remember Matthew chapter 16. You are Peter. Peter, who do people say that I am? Peter says, well, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, you are Peter. In Aramaic, it would have meant Cephas. Cephas means rock. You are Peter, Petra, rock. Okay? You are Petra, you're Peter, or this rock I will build my church. And there's a big debate then between Protestants and Catholics over this verse, particularly in Matthew 16. You are Peter, upon this rock I will build my church. The Roman Catholic Church uses that to kind of put Peter up on a pedestal and basically have him be the Pope and, the papacy coming out of that, you are Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, meaning the papacy on that. The Protestants saying, no, Peter was not the rock on which Jesus was building, but the confession was that Peter's confession, you are Christ, the Son of the living God, that the confession was the rock upon which Jesus would build the church. Actually, I don't like either of those approaches. I think actually Peter was the rock, and I think Peter, I would go back to Matthew's intent, and I think it's here that Peter is the consummate disciple. That Peter is the consummate disciple. So yeah, Peter is the rock upon which I will build my church. But he's not saying Peter himself, that is this Peter, but he's saying Peter as a disciple. In other words, the disciples are what I will build my church on. And we are Christ's disciples. And so I would take it as being a model, Peter being a model representing the disciples and on to the discipleship of the whole church and things. And that's what the church would be built on and things. So Peter is mentioned in this special thing with Peter, thou art Peter, upon this rock I will build my church. By the way, in that same passage too, if people try to put Peter up too high, you can be careful, because Peter, Jesus then after that kind of starts leveling with his disciples and saying, hey you guys, I'm going to die. I'm going to be crucified and things like that. And so it starts to get more serious there. And Peter then takes Jesus aside and rebukes him and says, hey, that's not going to happen to you. That's not going to happen to you. You're not going to die like that. You're the Messiah. And goes off on Jesus. And so then Jesus says, get thee behind me, Satan. You're concerned with things of men, not with things of God. And so Jesus rebukes Peter and says, "Get thee behind me, Satan." So then what is Peter going to be the great Satan too? That's what I'm saying. Peter is the consummate disciple. He's a representative disciple. And he's just showing that Peter makes some really good comments, Peter makes some really bad comments. And so he's like a disciple. He's a follower of Christ and kind of representative. The temple tax. This is another one that's kind of unique in Matthew, or in Matthew it's described. Does your master pay the temple tax? And so Peter goes to Jesus and says, "Well, Jesus, do you pay the temple tax?" And Jesus says, "Hey, Peter, go get a hook or whatever, go down and catch yourself a fish there, and in the fish you'll just pull out this coin, and this coin was like half a drachma or denarii or shekel or whatever, and basically half of the coin will pay for me and half for you. And so that coin then pays with half for Peter and half for Jesus." And that story is told in the book of Matthew. So Matthew is going to portray Peter as this kind of representative disciple, and is going to feature him. Peter's denial at the end of the book, tremendously tragic statement at the end of the book in Matthew chapter 26. Let me see if I can just pull this up. Matthew chapter 26, verse 69 and following. It's really tragic. Peter, so many great things, and basically, wherever you go, Jesus, I'm going to go, and no, you're not going to die, and basically, I'll protect you. Peter, you remember in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter whips out his sword and lops off the high priest's servant's ear. John tells us John apparently knew the guy, his name is Malchus, and says basically Peter lops off Malchus's ear, who was coming out to arrest Jesus. And Jesus tells Peter, "Put up your sword, okay? Those who live by the sword die by the sword. Don't mess with the sword, Peter. It's my time to die." And basically, Peter puts up the sword, and the people then know Jesus is not going to resist this and things, and so apparently it's going down. And in chapter 26, verse 69, it says, "Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and there was a servant girl came to him and said, 'You are Jesus of Galilee,' she said. But he denied it before them all. 'I don't know what you are talking about,' he said. And then he went to the gateway, and there was another girl saw him and said to the people there, 'This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth.' And he denied it again. 'I don't know the man.' And a little while those were standing near Peter said, 'Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away.'" It's like being from, and I just talked to a girl who was from Long Island. When they say Long Island, you know they're from Long Island, okay? And if they say let's go get our car and go down, you know they're from Boston. And if they say y'all, and especially in New England here, we've got a problem with somebody comes and says y'all, we know they're from down south. And if they're from down south, what happens? I always say in England, in New England, Boston area here, if they say y'all, their IQ just went down 20 points as far as how people look at them. But if they say, "I mate," and they talk like with a British accent, if they use a British accent, their IQ just went up 20 points. And so I always kind of laugh at New England because it's so funny. You say y'all, your IQ goes down. You say "I mate," and you talk British, and therefore your IQ goes up. And it's kind of ironic. But they said, "Hey, Peter, we know where you're from, man. You're from Galilee because we can tell your accent, and we recognize that anywhere." And Peter says no, and he denies the Lord 3 times. What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? A disciple of Jesus denying Christ 3 times? The question to ask yourself is that Peter or is that me? And there's points at which in my life I look and I say, I'm not so confident that I wouldn't deny Christ. And so you ask yourself, what would cause me to deny Christ? And these are big questions and things. And so I think all of us face the fact of denying Christ. Does anybody remember that girl out in Columbine, I think it was Colorado, and those guys were going through and killing the students, just point blank. And the guy basically pulls a gun on this girl, Columbine. This is a true story. And says, you're a Christian? Are you a Christian? She says, yes, I'm a Christian. And he pulls the trigger and blows her head off. Yeah. Do you deny Christ? You got a gun pointed to your head, do you deny Christ? Many of us would deny Christ for much smaller things and things. But how many times do we keep our mouth shut and we don't say that we're Christian followers because we don't want to, get into an argument with someone, and we deny Christ in so many subtle and very nuanced ways. We deny our commitment to Christ because we don't want to seem be seen as an evangelical, or worse, a fundamentalist, or, oh man, to be a follower of Christ. We don't want to be seen as a kind of a radical person. We want to be seen as a middle-of-the-road person who fits in, who's very nuanced and who's very thoughtful, and therefore we just, we deny Christ because we want to portray ourselves as being, intelligent or something, and afraid of. And in our culture, religion, basically, the secular culture has silenced religion. Religion becomes something that's very personal and private, and so it's very wrong in our culture to say anything religious because that's something that's very personal and private. So it's easier to talk about your sex life in public in America than it is to talk about your religion. I think you need to think about that. I wonder if something seems to be a little bit wrong there. But anyway, Peter denies the Lord 3 times. It's recorded in the book of Matthew. So Peter, special disciple in the book of Matthew, is a representative disciple, consummate disciple. Call and vocation. How do you get started being a disciple of Christ? There's a call. There's a call, or there's a vocation, calling to a vocation. And so what's interesting here is that the rabbis, in the case of the rabbis, often the students would go to the rabbi and say, hey, I got a 1500 on my SAT. You should accept me as your student. And so the student would go to the rabbi and try to sell himself to the rabbi, and the rabbi would approve this student and reject that student. That's not how Jesus did it. Jesus did not take applications from the students and think. Jesus went out to these people while they're in the midst of their life doing things what? What were Peter and Andrew doing? They're doing their fishing nets. And Jesus comes up to them and says, hey, you guys are casting nets or doing whatever you're doing. Come and follow me. There was a calling and there was a leaving. There was a calling and then there was a leaving. And so he called them and they left their nets. Okay, he comes up to James and John, the sons of Zebedee. And he comes up to James and John. They also were fishermen. And he comes up to them. In the process, they're, cleaning or doing something with their nets. And he calls them then, and James and John then leave their father Zebedee and follow Christ. And so there's this calling, and then there's this leaving. Jesus calling them in the midst of things. Did Jesus call the best the brightest? Did Jesus call the best and the brightest? Jesus called these fishermen in the midst of their jobs, not trained as rabbis and as thinkers. He called these people. So that what? God uses the foolish things of this world to confound the things that are wise, as Paul tells us. Corinthians. So Jesus calling, very important. He calls ordinary people in the midst of life, casting nets. These guys are not superstars. These guys are not superstars. Jesus actually so many times has to rebuke them and say, you guys still don't get it? He starts talking about the leaven of the Pharisees, and they think, oh man, we forgot to bring food. And so they go off and say, we did this thing, it was really stupid, we forgot to bring food. Jesus is getting our case. He's doing it in a roundabout way. He's talking about the leaven of the Pharisees. And Jesus says, you don't understand? I just fed 5,000 people. How many baskets did you pick up, man? I just fed 4,000 people. And how many baskets did you pick up? And am I worried about not having enough food and the leaven of the Pharisees? I'm talking to you about the leaven of the Pharisees. And he rebukes his disciples for not understanding and stuff. So sometimes the disciples just don't get it. And that's because they're not really trained that well in terms of, those types of things.